Yeah, excuse me? What is this NPC's name?
Yeah, do they have any family? I have to go to the bathroom.
What year was this town founded?
Yeah, right. Those leather tanning techniques didn't exist until the year 5174.
Can I do a history check on the post office? Can I do a history check on this tavern? Can I do a history check on this NPC?
What are these two potions?
What year does this adventure take place in relation to the Goblin
Can I do a
Buffalo?
history check on this NPC?
What color are her boots?
Would my character know that?
Fuchsia didn't exist at this time.
This creature have
I missed the last 10 minutes. Can you read that again?
How's it going, everybody? On today's edition of GM Help, I'm going to be talking about the big scary. Running a pre-published D&D or Pathfinder module. I've been GMing D&D 5e and Pathfinder 1st edition for years. So now with the addition of Pathfinder 2e, there is a ton of pre-published material for me to use as a GM. Here's the problem with that. These books that contain these adventures are absolutely massive. They contain pages upon pages of stat blocks, NPC information, historical places, timelines, flavor text, you name it. These books are jam-packed, full of material ready for GMs to use. All of this information is overwhelming and it's completely intimidating. And to be honest with you, the first time I ever ran an adventure straight out of a book was a year ago. And in preparing to run that adventure last year and my current adventure, Pathfinder 2e's Hell Knight Hill, I learned a lot of things. And once I approached preparing a pre-published adventure in a new way with a different mindset, it actually becomes a lot less stressful. There was a stress about wanting to do everything by the book and trying to keep everything all in line and make sure you know the ins and outs of this adventure, the setting, the NPCs, the culture, all of it, just so you don't make a mistake. And so I came up with these 3 tips to help guide you in preparing to run a pre-published adventure or a module. I promise it's not as scary as it seems. Okay, so my first tip is something that is heavily debated in the GMing community. And I see a ton of people going back and forth on the internet about whether or not you need to read the whole thing. I'm gonna be blunt with you. You do not have to read the whole thing. But what about the boss battle at the end? Shouldn't you know the mechanics so you can prepare your players along the way? Yeah, and you should probably start prepping the murder mystery that takes place in chapter 4. You're gonna wanna know all the NPC's motivations. No. You don't need to prep every single encounter that's in the book, and you don't need to know the ins and outs of a city that your players aren't going to even get to for 6 months. There's just no point, and you're going to burn yourself out. Especially some of the large adventure paths that Paizo puts out for Pathfinder. These things are 6 books, and they are huge, and they're meant to be played over the course of multiple years. So of course you don't need to know everything about the entire adventure from start to finish. You don't need to read the whole thing, so don't worry. However, I will say that you should at least skim every part of the adventure. Do you need to read the mechanics about every encounter? No. Do you need to memorize the monologue that's written in there for the villain that your players aren't even going to encounter for a year? No, of course not. Most of these pre-published modules, especially the larger ones, do a really good job of summarizing the different parts of the adventure from chapter to chapter. They'll be either at the beginning or the end of each book or chapter depending on how big the actual adventure that you're running is. So you do want to familiarize yourself with the overall story arc. That will help you when you're planning and when you're having to improvise along the way. Once you familiarize yourself with the general story, you know where it begins, where it ends, and all of the main story beats that take place in between. I would suggest that you skim through and yes, look at every single page in the adventure and picking out some key information that'll help you. Information such as, who are the NPCs in this adventure? What are their motivations and what are their relationships to each other? This doesn't need to be super detailed. This can be at a very high level, but just so you know who the NPCs are in this adventure and why they matter to the story. I would also maybe take note of, again, at a very high level, the places that this adventure will take you. At least just skim it and know a little bit about it. You don't need to be able to answer society checks about this place or know its entire history. But you should know at least its name, where it is, and how the players are supposed to get there. Finally, just fill in the details a little bit in your mind about the story that was summarized throughout the chapters. The summary, for example, might tell you that the players travel through a dangerous forest, make their way to this haunted castle, and once they get there, they fight some skeletons. If the players are supposed to have met a key NPC, or fight an important battle, or come across a moral dilemma while they're on the way to that castle, you're going to want to know ahead of time that that is going to happen. You don't need to read the mechanics of the encounter, you don't need to read everything about that NPC. Fill in those gaps a little bit and just take a mental note, and that way it'll make it a lot easier for you when it's actually time to prep that session. And that segues into my next tip. You don't need to prep the whole module. That was one of the biggest turnoffs for me when it came to pre-published adventures. How am I supposed to know all the details about this story before I even begin to GM it? Well, you don't. I'm going to be making another video on the specifics of how to prep a session that is pulled from a pre-published adventure. But for now, you don't need to be prepared for the things that happen in Chapter 4 when your players are just starting out in Chapter 1. Prepare up to a certain point where you feel that is reasonable for the players to get to within that time of your first session, and you'll be good to go. Of course, as part of your normal prep for that part of Chapter 1, you will do a little bit more in-depth work and prep about the specific locations and NPCs that the players interact with, but you only need to do that as you go along. You don't need to do that for the entire book. And as a GM that ran games that were always homebrew, it's a very comforting thing to know that it's no different than when you homebrew an adventure, you have a big idea about the story arc, and you only need to prepare in detail enough material for one, maybe a few sessions at a time. And it's no different with a pre-published adventure. Now it's time for tip 3. This one might be the most important of all. You don't need to run the adventure by the book. Everything that takes place in this adventure should be a guide. It's not set in stone. You're going to want to morph the adventure around your players and your characters anyway, just like you would with any other adventure. And there is no such thing as messing up the story, or saying something wrong, or ruining something that's supposed to happen 6 months from now. Just because it's written down in that book that things are supposed to happen in this way, in this order, doesn't mean anything. Throw it out. That's one of the reasons why my first tip is to skim the adventure. You should have a pretty good idea of the key NPCs and the story beats so that if you want to or need to, you can rewrite them. And to feel confident doing that, you're going to want to know at least how the NPCs are related with each other's story so that if you have to rewrite that piece of the adventure, you'll know that it also will affect this piece of the adventure, and you can just change that too. Worst comes to worst. If you're improvising in the moment, or you blank on something, or you skip an important paragraph, you will have in-between sessions. Just think about it and come up with a way to get the story back on track, or rewrite this NPC, or change their purpose in the adventure. It's really up to you. And that's why it's only really important to prep for the material that you need at that time. Anything else that happens in the future is fluid. And that's the same with a homebrew adventure or a pre-published one. In a future video, I'm going to go a little bit more in depth about when you're preparing those individual sessions, how you can make the adventure your own and how you can prepare yourself for running that little piece of the module. But for now, all you have to know is that this adventure, this story, this book in front of you is just a guide, and it's a jumping off point, and you should treat it that way. You're going to want to morph it to your group's play style and tweak things and pull inspiration from other sources. And that's how it should be done. You can't possibly get it wrong because it is your game. Have faith in yourself as a GM and use the book like it's meant to be used, as a guide.